So if you can hear me, I would now like to introduce you to our presenter tonight, Ed Barron. Ed holds a temporary license as a licensed professional counselor, mental health service provider. He provides counseling to adults, couples, children, adolescents, families, and groups, specializing in divorce, children of divorce, and blended families. He works with those experiencing a variety of problems, including anxiety, depression, grief and loss, individuals in crisis, as well as those struggling with chronic concerns. Ed holds a master's degree in mental health counseling from Gardner-Webb University, and his goal is to create a safe space for clients to be respected and understood from their perspective. So Ed, thank you so much for being with us, and I will pass the mic over to you.
All right, thanks, Abby. I appreciate it. So as we get started this evening, thanks for being with us tonight. I've got a few things I want to make sure that we cover in the beginning to kind of help us set the tone for our night. So we've got a few areas we're going to cover with our topics, looking at some guidelines for our workshop tonight. We'll do a psychoeducational piece on emotional reaction and response. We'll look at communication, really two forms of communication. We'll look at active listening. We'll look at self-confident communication, and how to resolve conflict when all of this kind of falls apart. So we can start off with looking at our workshop guidelines for tonight that can also be used as your household guidelines. So there are 4 of them, and I'm going to go into kind of what each one of those means. So Abby, do I have the ball? Yes, thank you. I'm sorry. All right, so this is our outline for tonight. So we're going to look at the guiding principles. We're going to look at a psychoeducational piece, communication, that we'll kind of look at active listening, and then we'll look at boundaries and what that looks like, and then have some opportunities for questions and answers. The workshop principle, the guideline principles, first, to be open to new ways of thinking and ideas. Here's the deal. We were all parented probably appropriately when we grew up. But now, as we live in a different world, it might be time for us to look at a different way of parenting. The experiences of our life offer us opportunities to learn how to be better parents. For some of these experiences, we learn how we want to be. And for others, not so positive experiences, we may have learned how we don't want to be. Let's be the model for our children and our families with intentional actions that support our words. Secondly, consider principle-centered parenting. While the world has and will continue to change, principles remain the same. So what's a principle? It's a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as a foundation for a system of beliefs or behaviors. For example, maybe your faith tradition has a set of principles that are true today, tomorrow, and forever. Author, speaker, and professor Dr. Stephen R. Covey, in his book, The Leader in Me, based on the 7 habits of highly effective people, writes, a parent cannot follow their children around everywhere and make every decision for them. Some have tried and all have failed. The only approach that I know that gives parents the hope of truly providing their children with around-the-clock protection is that of instilling within them the internal desire to make right choices, even when no one is watching. And the only way that I know to do that is to teach children correct principles, and the earlier, the better. In our time today, I would ask that we would work together on 2 of the 7 principles. Habit 1, be proactive. Take responsibility for your actions, to acknowledge mistakes rather than blaming others or making excuses, to show initiative, and to remain in charge of your emotions. Habit 5, seek first to understand and then be understood. to listen to others' feelings with empathy, to understand them from their perspective, not judge, and be open to input, and to know how to express yourself confidently. Number 3, the assumption that everyone, children, teens, parents, other caregivers, is doing the best they can. Parents, in that moment when our kids, or anyone else for that matter, is doing something foolish, they break something, behave inappropriate, or fail to meet our expectations, it's easy to criticize, yell, and humiliate. It's in those moments, if we remind ourselves that everyone is doing the best they can, everything changes. Rather than feeling the need to criticize or punish, you'll find yourself thinking, this is the best my child can do right now. It's not acceptable. It's not what I want. But for that moment, they can't do any better. Instantly, you transition from enforcer to teacher. Your role as a parent is not to punish, but to teach. Help your child develop more effective behaviors means less tension and less disagreement. This everyone is doing the best they can also applies to parents. It's not just about the kids. When you consider those moments when parents fall short of the mark and they criticize, yell, or humiliate, they feel guilty and they blame themselves for not being a good parent, which doesn't help. After a while, there's a good chance that they'll blame the kids for making them feel guilty, and the cycle of yelling and feeling guilty continues. Parents own shortcomings and face them head on. Remember, everyone is doing the best they can, gives you the best chance to become the best parent you possibly can be. And then finally, respect each person's stage of development and maturity. Understand that we're all at different stages of development and maturity. Physical growth is easy to see, but emotional, mental, and social development are difficult. All require nurturing from a parent, caretaker, or other trusted adult. Maturity is on a continuum. We're all born into this world depending on someone else, depending on them for food, for care. But as we mature, our dependency, if we remain dependent, then it becomes, I depend, you do for me. I remain dependent, and when I fail, I can blame you for that. But as I grow and as I mature, independence is where I can do for myself. If I fail, I take responsibility. And then finally, the interdependent side is where we can do things together, where if we fail, we can problem solve together for a better result. It's that interdependence that families rely upon and enable parents to be able to have healthy relationships with children and other family members. So moving on to the next slide, let's take a look at some cool stuff here, I guess, really, right? So this is kind of an emotional reaction versus response. So looking at the power couple, the amygdala. So if you look at that bottom red arrow, that little almond-shaped piece that the red arrow is on, that's the amygdala. It's part of the limbic system. It's a structure that involves many of our emotions and motivations, particularly those that are related to survival. It is involved with the processing of emotions such as fear, anger, and pleasure. And then that top portion, or that top arrow, is the prefrontal cortex, which is part of the frontal lobe. It is known as the executive functioning area of the brain. It has the ability to work out conflicting thoughts, determining what's good, bad, better or best, same or different. Above all, social control, its ability to suppress the urges that lead to socially unacceptable situations. As we sense danger coming our way, while the amygdala is trying to turn on the fight or flight response, At the same time, the prefrontal cortex is processing the information to determine whether it's actually a danger and how to deal with it in a rational, logical way. Now, this all sounds good, right? Sure. So when does this power couple start working for me? Think back to one of our guiding principles, respecting each person's stage of development and maturity. While the brain really doesn't increase in size during childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood, the systems of the brain continue to develop until age 25. So this explains why children, teens, and young adults may have problems and lack of judgment and impulse control. While the spatial and sensory, auditory, and language areas of the brain are developing, the prefrontal cortex, that executive function that kind of controls the good, the bad, is not fully developed. And they're dependent upon the amygdala, where the emotion lies, for information and processing. So it's anger and it's fear, it's that fight or flight response. So that's how sometimes when we're uncertain about how we can really control that. So let's take a look at the next slide and see when we can recognize that emotional hijack when we are in the middle of something, and how we can flip the switch, and can we retrain our brain? So how can we change? How can we stop this emotional hijack? What can we do when we're in the heat of the moment that allows for the brain, which is not fully developed in most of our family members? How can we retrain our brain? How can we shift from that emotional reaction and the potential negative consequences to stop, to think, to filter through our values, our beliefs, integrity, and character to a positive response? Can we truly transition from enforcer to teacher? Remember, our role as a parent is not to punish, but to teach. And for others, it's really up to them. And as we model the behavior and our actions support our words, we become the best model for our children to be able to see how we control the emotional hijack and make positive choices and responses. So the first part of communication we're going to look at is active listening. So active listening is a process. It's an active process rather than a passive one. It means participating in the conversation rather than acting as an audience. Active listeners show they are listening, encourage sharing, and strive to understand the speaker. So showing that you're listening and showing interest and empathy. You think about when you're talking with someone and about putting away distractions. So you're not on your telephone. When you're showing someone that you're listening, that you're really paying attention and you're really engaged, you put away your phone, you turn off the television, you stop doing other things, and you pay complete attention to them. You use verbal and nonverbal communication so that you're doing things, you may acknowledge them by, well, hey, that makes sense, or or even some head nods or some eye contact would show that you're listening to them. So second, encouraging sharing by asking questions, and not just regular questions that can be answered by a yes or no, but think about open-ended questions that can't be answered by a yes or no. Think about how you might ask a question that you want to know instead of, what did you have for lunch today? Hamburger. How was lunch today? So maybe you can get a little bit more elaborate on that. So asking an open-ended question and then reflecting back what you hear from that person helps to understand what they really said. So if you're not understanding what they said, maybe you can reflect back. So what I think I hear you saying is this. So you can kind of reflect back using your words or using their words to clarify your understanding. And then summarizing the key points. You want to pay attention to their tone as well as their body language, because even though someone may not be speaking, you can see things in their body language that may suggest something else is going on that they want to speak about, but it's not really coming out yet. So maybe another type of question, or maybe another open-ended question might help them. And then finally, seeking to understand. I mean, that was one of the habits that we looked at. So how we seek to understand someone is by being present. What does being present mean? It means focused on them. It's putting away those distractions. They are the most important thing in that particular moment that you're trying to learn from, and you're seeking to understand them, again, from their perspective. Listen with an open mind. You're not there to be ready. And so often when we are listening, and listening is not a skill that we really learn a lot of in school. We don't learn how to write, we learn how to read, we learn how to speak, but we don't necessarily learn how to listen. So if we fully listen and engage in the conversation through those interactive ways and become an active listener and not just an audience and sitting back and watching and preparing ourselves for the answer. So I have a question for you here. So if you have an answer to this, we'd appreciate you typing it in the chat. So I want you to think about a time when you've experienced an active listening conversation, and how did it feel? Okay, I see encouraged, I felt supported, I felt cared for. Great, what else we got out there? It felt good that the other person was trying to understand my viewpoint. Good. Validated. I felt I felt what I was saying meant something. Anybody else? I mean, that's great. Those are great responses. So kind of flip that and say, if that's the way that you felt, how could you make someone feel that way too? So become an active listener. All right, let's flip over to, all right, so we're going to look at another form of communication. So the listening part is hard. The speaking part may be a little bit easier, but we're going to look at something, and you may see this as being assertive communication. I like the word self-confident communication. That kind of describes, I have the ability to speak for myself, and that's what this form of communication is about. So here are some traits that we want to just take a look at. That self-confident communication is communication style where the person stands up for their own needs and wants. Also taking in consideration the needs of others. So it's this respect that we have for the person, not only that we're speaking to, but it's respect for ourselves as well, without being passive or aggressive. So the tips are, so really just self-confident is to clearly state your needs and your wants. So being able to state what I need and what I want. Eye contact. Again, eye contact is so important that when we look away from someone and not giving them eye contact doesn't really reflect being present with them. Listening to others without interruption. So kind of giving them the chance to say everything that they need to say. And sometimes that's hard because we're always waiting to give a response. So somebody's talking to us and we're ready to give a response, and we're just waiting for a time for them to stop, and we can give them a response. So listen without interrupting. Have a steady tone of voice, not high or low, or your tone is just a very smooth, even tone. Appropriate speaking volume. So you're not yelling, you're not screaming, you have a very even tone. You have confident body language. Again, that eye contact is important. How you carry yourself, how you hold yourself are positive traits to self-confident communication. Some of the tips is, show respect for yourself. because you're the person that is expressing what you feel, what you want, and what you need in this particular moment to another person. And it's okay. It's okay to be able to express yourself in that way. When we suppress what we're feeling and what we're thinking, then that doesn't allow for us to be the person that we were created to be. Plan what you're going to say. So you may take a little bit of time between when you want to speak to someone in this way versus at that moment. So think back at that emotional hijack time. So is that the best time for me to say something that needs to be said? Or is it better for me to take a little bit of time to process through and to think and plan what I really want to say? Express your thoughts calmly. So take your time and express them calmly, consistently, making sure that it's clear, it's calm, and it's consistent. And it's okay to say no. If there's something that needs to be addressed, you can't make everyone happy all the time. When you need to say no, you just need to say no without lying for the reason, but offering to help problem solve for another solution. And then to avoid would be the silent treatment. Nobody likes to be just completely cut off or walk away from a situation. So how do you stay in the moment and you just don't walk away from it? You take the opportunity to communicate. Don't be threatening or shaming and then yelling. So being able to hold on to your emotional control as you're speaking to someone. So on the next slide, we're going to take a look at a couple of things on just kind of a formula for self-confident communication. So you see the first box, it's kind of the I feel X when you Y, in situation Z, and I would like. This is kind of a formula. I mean, it's just kind of a formula that you can substitute anything in. So whatever feeling you might have when a person does something in a particular way and when that particular situation occurs, and then what you want to see as the result of that. So the first one is like, I feel angry. I feel angry when you leave your socks and underwear on the floor. When? After work. And what you would like to have happen is to put it in the hamper. Right? So, I mean, it's everybody just caring for themselves, but you feel angry, and that's okay to express that anger. Or, I feel loved when you kiss me. When you get home is when I want it to happen. And then I would like it to happen every day. So again, if you express yourself in this way, you're being self-confident, you're saying what you feel, you're saying when it happens, and you're saying what you want to occur as a result of the conversation. So hopefully that'll be something that you can use as a guide in the future. So, all right, so we're trying to do everything we can because that's all we can do. So what happens when doing all you can, but the results doesn't come to a resolution? You can't come to a resolution. So how do we solve conflict in a healthy way? And I think for me, I reflect back on what we have talked about already with self-confident communication and being an active listener. And when we consider communication in the detail that we've covered in the presentation, conflict is easier to manage. But here are 7 tips that might be helpful. So again, being self-confident. It's okay to engage in healthy conflict. It begins with learning how to balance between the line of brutal honesty and necessary honesty. Don't belabor the point, get straight to the point. If you've got something to say it without beating around the bush. Pay attention to your behavior. You're the person that has control of your behavior. the other person, you don't have any control over that person. Replace your you statements with I statements, which we saw in that last example. Focus on the issue, not the person. So it's not a personal attack on the person, it's the situation that's occurring. Reflection, again, it's saying the words that the person has said to you in their words, or using summary to be able to pick up the key points of that. But it gives you the opportunity to clarify what the person is saying. And sometimes that reduces the conflict just by them being heard and being understood. And then finally, you're seeking to understand, not necessarily agree, but to at least understand where they're coming from. So those are just some tips on some healthy conflict when things kind of go off the rails, when you can't come to resolution. But I think if you really look at some of the ways that active communication and self-confident communication, it's very similar. If we can stay in that kind of mode, and again, if we can look at some of those guiding principles that we started with this evening and incorporate some of those in our household, then we are able to do that, or in our workplace or in other places that we have the opportunity to bring some principle-centered opportunities, whether it's in parenting or whether it's in other friendships or work relationships. So now we're going to look at boundaries. So what are boundaries? Boundaries are limits set around ourselves physically, emotionally, personally, sexually, spiritually. A boundary helps us to determine where we end and another person begins. Examples of a physical boundary refer to personal spaces and physical touch. When is it appropriate to, and when is it appropriate not to? Physical spaces may be like, going into someone's bedroom, or going into someone's office, or going into a place that's their personal space and just coming and rummaging through that. So that's a violation of their personal space, their physical space. Emotional refers to a person's feelings, limitations on when to share and when not to share personal information. So often we find ourselves in a place where we want to share, but we're not sure, or we share too much and it scares people away, or, so how we determine that emotional boundary for ourselves and understand that other people have those boundaries as well. Understanding someone from their perspective helps us understand some of their boundaries that they have set for themselves, which is everyone's role, is to set their own boundaries for their physical, emotional, personal space. All right, so to understand boundaries, you need to know the theme throughout boundaries is responsibility, a duty or control over, an authority, the right to give requests, make decisions, and enforce. According to Salvador Minuchin, boundaries can be clear, where responsibilities and authorities is explicit, communicated, and understood. For example, Monday morning, I have a project due, so I will not be able to spend time with you this weekend. So it's stating what is expected, what you have going on, and it's very clear, it's very concise, it's very well thought out, where responsibilities and authority lie. Understanding boundaries, you need to know disengagement, where responsibilities and authority are enforced, but not well explained or communicated. Communication is strained, especially across subsystems like parents and children. Expectations are expected rather than explained. For example, a parent who is not involved in the day-to-day life of children being the disciplinarian. You also need to know about enmeshed boundaries, where responsibility and authority are blurred. It's hard to tell who has what, often, but not often present in subsystems as well. So same thing with families, children and parents. For example, mom talking to a daughter about a difficult day rather than a friend or spouse. So bringing a child into an adult conversation might be a little bit of enmeshment. Boundaries are unique to each family, couple, friendship, parent, child, in-laws, co-workers, and strangers. So boundaries, you have unique boundaries for each family, for each couple, for each relationship. While there are many good resources with examples of boundaries, the goal of setting boundaries is personal. It could be collective depending on the situation, like a family or a couple or co-workers. Just remember, boundaries are designed to meet your needs, wants, and desires, not someone else's or a cookie cutter example. While cookie cutter examples might be good ways to get ideas, it's not necessarily tried and true to write down someone else's boundary based on what their need is, not your need. Boundaries can change depending on how the relationship changes. So as people grow, develop, and mature, boundaries can and will need to change. For example, a boundary developed when my daughter was 12 is different now that she's 30. Parenting an adult is different than parenting a teen. So our boundaries have changed as she's become a mother, as she's become a wife, as she's become involved in her community, in her life. The boundary is different. So boundaries change based on how the relationship changes. Boundaries developed in a relationship where trust was broken or gained need to be redeveloped based upon the events that changed that relationship. So maybe something occurred in a relationship that caused there to be a trust broken, or maybe in a relationship where trust was regained. Well, how do you create a boundary around that new relationship? So be ready when things change, because they could change in the relationships that you have. So takeaways. So for communication and boundary, or both communications and boundary require responsibility. The ability to accurately assess what is my duty and authority to take care of, and the authority to take care of what is and is not mine.